Thank you so much, Madam President, for allowing me to be here today. Thank you so much to all of you as members of the Oxford Union and coming out and allowing me to come. I come from Zimbabwe as a very ordinary and humble citizen. And I do ask that as you listen to me this evening, my brief remarks, do take note that I am just an ordinary person from the street and not highly educated. And the only qualification I have to speak on behalf of my nation is that of being a passionate citizen that wants to see Zimbabwe become a better nation than she is now. She has a lot of potential which has been suppressed over the years. My journey so far in the last 2 years maybe is possibly one of the unlikeliest. You couldn't have paid me enough money to make me believe that one day I would walk the kind of walk that I've walked in the last few months. But I think that sometimes when destiny and purpose meet and you're called upon to serve your generation, there's no way out. A little under 2 years ago, I was sitting in my little office as a pastor of a small church, trying to figure out how I was going to put food on the table for my family. My wife was pregnant at the time, and I had 2 little kids, a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and it just wasn't working out. Zimbabwe was becoming tough once again. And Zimbabwe has these cycles and seasons over the years where she really just breaks down. The economy falls off the face of the earth and people suffer. And in the last breakdown of our economy, we had inflation that went up to thousands of percentages, and we had a $100 trillion note. And our president at the time had made up his mind that he was going to die in power. In fact, his wife had made the declaration that even if he died, he would rule from the grave. And so I sat there trying to figure out, how do I feed my family? Or how do I prosper? How do I succeed? How do my dreams come to pass in a place like Zimbabwe? So I'd recorded a small video. It was a 4-minute video, impromptu. It didn't have a script. And in this video, I started talking about how our nation, Zimbabwe, was a promise that had been broken. And I raised our nation's flag, the Zimbabwe flag, which I now carry with me everywhere I go. I've carried this exact flag for over just under 2 years now. I've been to prison with it. I've escaped the country with it through, under the cover of night through borders. But it's become a symbol of reclaiming the promise of Zimbabwe. In this little video, I spoke about how everything that this flag symbolizes, and if you know anything about the Zimbabwe flag, every color and every symbol has a meaning on it. And I began to speak about how the green that speaks about our agricultural backbone for our economy no longer functioned. I spoke about how the yellow that speaks about the minerals that we have in Zimbabwe have not benefited the citizens, but only the political elite. We spoke about how the red that represents those that lost their lives in the fight for freedom from colonialism, but now look like they fought for nothing and their blood was shed in vain. I spoke about the black, which speaks about the black majority, and now that it only resembles those that suffer the most. The white, which speaks about peace, which resembles no peace at all but turmoil in the hearts of Zimbabweans. But in that video, I made a call. And I said, if you care about Zimbabwe and you're a Zimbabwean, then you have no right to be called a citizen of this country if you cannot speak up for her. And so I posted that little video up on Facebook, not knowing what would happen, one of the scariest seasons of my life. And of course, the story involved from there. We began to walk a journey where we started to bring up the ordinary citizen to speak up for themselves and to embolden ordinary citizens to speak up against the authoritarian regime of Robert Mugabe. Since then, we inspired a number of actions, some which included a shutdown of the whole country. We were able, with a small group of young people, were able to inspire over 9 million people to shut their doors of their businesses, to not go to school, to not go to work, and stay at home as a protest to Robert Mugabe, that enough was enough and we wanted a change. And the reason why we chose this boycott and protest of staying at home is because in Zimbabwe, it was and still is illegal by law to protest. To get out, if 3 or 4 people need to have a political protest in Zimbabwe, you have to get permission from the government, otherwise you are arrested. And so for the first time, our government didn't know what to do because millions of people had just stayed at home, and it's not illegal to stay at home. But of course, the unthinkable happened, and we were hounded out of our homes and arrested with a few other young people. And they began the journey of going in and out of prisons and in and out of court appearances. I remember taking my family out after things had become very dangerous. Some unknown men had visited my children's school and demanded to see my children. My wife had been accosted whilst she was arriving home by a group of youths from ZANU-PF at the time, and they wanted to take her away. And so it became important for me to take my family out, and fortunately I was able to do that. And we escaped under the cover of darkness, and after a few months my daughter was born. And after I'd seen her, it had been a month after she was born, I decided it was time to go back to Zimbabwe. And first of all, clear my name, because I felt that I was not someone who had committed a crime, but more importantly, that there was a case and a cause for us to accomplish in Zimbabwe. As a pastor, I draw a lot of my inspiration from the Bible. And there's a story in the Bible about a young man called David. And when David is faced with Goliath, his brothers, David's older brothers, look at him and they say to him, "What do you want here? Why are you here?" He says, and they say to him, "We know your conceited heart. Should you not be looking after those few sheep?" Because he was a shepherd boy. And David makes a response to them. And he says to them, "Is there no cause?" And this was the sense. A lot of people ask me, why did you go back to Zimbabwe after you had escaped? And one of my questions or comments has always been, is there no cause? I turned 40 last year in March, but just before I turned 40 on the 1st of February, I returned home to Zimbabwe. And as I arrived at Harare International Airport on 1st February 2017, I was arrested and taken in by the intelligence and was locked up in Chikurubi Maximum Security Prison, which is our highest security prison in Zimbabwe, and one of the most notorious, and spent 2 weeks there. But that changed me, because again it proved to me that indeed there was a cause for Zimbabwe. Since then, we spent 11 months. My passport was taken away from me, couldn't travel. I haven't seen my family even up to now for the past 13 months. I'm hoping to see them pretty soon. But we began a journey where we realized that as a generation, we have a role to play. Those that are 40 years and below in Zimbabwe, this is the time that their voice must speak up to protect their future. A lot remains to be done. We've lost a lot of people in the last couple of years as we fight for freedom in Zimbabwe. On the 18th of November 2017, a phenomenal event took place in Zimbabwe, something that most of us never thought we would see. The military finally decided that they would stand up against Robert Mugabe for their own reasons. At that very point, we saw an opportunity for the citizens of Zimbabwe to step up and do something that many never thought they would see in their own lifetime. We stood up to march and to protest and to demand Robert Mugabe to go. And for the first time, almost 1 million people gathered in our streets, and even Zimbabweans across the world, and marched against Robert Mugabe. And a few days later, he resigned. Now we find ourselves in what is called a new dispensation, or what is called a new era in Zimbabwe. But our job is not completely done. We still have work to do. In the next couple of months, Zimbabwe goes to elections. And the critical role of young people and ordinary citizens has never been more important than right now. In fact, the key that we are finding out, at least that I am finding out, is that the missing factor in the democracy of Zimbabwe, the missing factor in the turnaround and progress of Zimbabwe, has been the mass involvement of ordinary Zimbabweans. And that's what we fight for. And part of our mantra at this Flag Citizens movement, which is a movement which I founded quite accidentally, is it says, if we cannot cause the politician to change, then we must inspire the citizen to be bold. And that continues to be my work. Even as I travel, I had the opportunity to address the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy about a week ago. And again, for me, the honor was that mine is a representation of the voice of those people that have never had the chance to speak up and to say what they feel, or to cry out for the freedom that they need. We have a small window, and my hope is that we will be able to utilize that window as much as we can to make sure that Zimbabwe breaks free and becomes the beautiful nation that she is, and that she takes up her place, an honorable place amongst the nations of the world. Thank you very, very much once again.
So before we move on to some questions from the audience, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things you mentioned during your short speech. So you talked about how you were inspired to create this flag clip, but did you ever expect to receive the response that you did?
Oh, absolutely not. I think that when I did that first little video, it really was a very personal rant, if I can use that word. Yes, it was on my Facebook page, and I think it was a moment where I just thought I need to tell somebody how I feel. I really felt at that time that Zimbabwe had stood in the way of my dreams personally. And so, yeah, I didn't expect that at all. And it was a surprise when the next day I started getting phone calls from people saying, "Hey, are you serious? Did you do this? It's great, but this is also crazy. What are you doing?" Yeah. So that began, I think, something that became quite irreversible. There were moments I thought I need to keep quiet and get out of it, but it just kept growing. And eventually I think I stopped resisting, its growth and its progress.
Okay. You also mentioned that the response that you got meant that you had to flee to South Africa before then moving to the US. Do you think that the separation and danger the movement has put your family in has been worth it?
There is one thing that I have feared more than death itself. And that thing is my children asking me 20 years from now, when my daughter is 20, 25, and she says to me, "Dad, why did you not do anything?" Because Zimbabwe is her country. That's the place that she has to go back to. In fact, that's the place that she's identified. When she goes out to the rest of the world, she has to say she's from Zimbabwe. And one of the things my generation has gone through is to carry the embarrassment of coming from Zimbabwe in terms of what has happened to our country. Yeah. And so, yes, I think in many ways it was worth it. It's worth being able to teach my children how to be responsible citizens. It's been worth being able to allow my children to stand up one day and say, I'm part of a family that did something about the situation in Zimbabwe, no matter what the outcome is. I think that the worst thing that my generation could have done was to inherit what the generation before us did, which was nothing about the situation. And there are reasons why they did nothing. But I think at some point, someone has to stand up and say, look, if it means, if my life is taken because of this, then so be it. But I must say it's a difficult decision and a very scary one too.
Yeah. So what is it that keeps you motivated when things do seem scary?
Well, what keeps me motivated when things seem scary, I think, in the last few months has been the result of what more and more ordinary citizens have been able to do. One of the things that we've learned in Zimbabwe, which I think a lot of people that have done what I and others have done in the past, is the discovery that it only takes one voice to create change. It only takes one person who is willing, one person who has the commitment to get something going. And we stood up against a regime that had the entire military at their disposal, the entire intelligence system at their disposal. But simple citizens with nothing but their voices, and I think technology was on our side, we were able to make changes. So I think that keeps me going, that start where you are with what you have and the world will respond to your passion.
Okay, so local NGOs reported that the country has seen record abduction, assault and torture against civil society actors and opposition members. Do you think that this violence and bloodshed are necessary in order to create real change?
Certainly not. I think that it's not necessary for people to lose their lives and for people to be hurt for us to see the kind of change that we have to see. But I think it then becomes necessary when there is no other option. Many years ago in the 1960s, my father and many of the people in his generation came to that realization that there was going to be no other choice but to face death to be able to see the kind of freedom that they wanted to see. My hope is that we can move Zimbabwe towards a place where it is about a contestation of ideas and not the abduction of people. That helps us to kind of bring the change that we need. I hope that my life and my case continues to be a reminder that it's possible without violence and without having to lose your life to be able to start a journey of change and see a result of it.
How do you think that we can move people away from the violence?
I started learning about, officially or formally learning about the non-violent, confrontation of brutal regimes. Just literally quite after we had started the movement, I was out of my depth. I didn't know what I was doing. We were being intimidated and followed. I remember there was a time we probably spent about 2 weeks moving from one safe house to another within the city just to be safe. But I think that has probably become the saving grace of some of the results that we had in Zimbabwe. For example, on November 18, when almost 1 million people came out to march wanting Robert Mugabe to leave office, it was amazing because it was people from every party, it was people from every race, from every tribe. And the one aspect that everybody agreed was that there was no violence, there was no breaking of anything, there was no fighting, there was none of that. So I think that this is part of what this Flag Citizens movement is all about. It's about teaching people the fact that you can bring end to oppression by becoming more and more aware of what your rights are. I think sometimes people resort to violence when they don't understand the power of simply exercising your right and exercising it repeatedly up until you get a breakthrough.
So through education? Absolutely. And how do you think that you can get that message across to young people in the most effective manner?
Well, young people, particularly in Zimbabwe, of course, there's the usual aspect of young people being very much interested in music and so forth. But one of the ways in which we've found that is able to educate young people concerning nonviolent action for change is by learning to engage the political process itself, and learning to engage it differently. We found out that I found out that if you engage the issues, then you would have to engage in a conversation. And if you engage in a conversation, then you would have to get some sort of solutions or outcomes from your conversation. And I think that for us, or for me, has become part of the vocation to encourage more and more conversations to take place about the issues and let people know that you can speak freely, that you can oppose or disagree and still come to the end of the conversation and agree to work together in some sort of a way. And I think that's part of what we are learning in Zimbabwe, especially now as we go towards elections. The push for an environment that is not violent, that is free, that is fair, that has a different political culture is on right now. And more, I think young people are shunning political actors that are violent themselves.
Okay, So this is a slightly different question, but what do you say to the critics and the supporters who've reportedly been resentful of the fact that you fled?
Well, I think that if I was in their shoes, at the time that I left, if I was in their shoes, I would feel the same way. If you've been under oppression, brutal oppression for 37 years, and then you have a moment of hope, and then that moment of hope seems to vanish with an individual who was at the front of it, you would feel very disappointed. So if I was in their shoes, I would feel exactly the same. But I would also imagine that if they were in my shoes, they would do exactly what I did as well. Yeah. The thing for me that is vitally important to understand is that we don't have to gather around an individual to see the kind of freedom that we want. We must gather around an idea. And one of the things that has let us down in Africa and in Zimbabwe as well is the fact that people are drawn more to personalities than they are drawn to an idea. And sometimes when the personality then takes advantage of the following and captures the people, people don't know how to get free. And this is the case is with Robert Mugabe. When he came to power in the 80s, the whole nation galvanized around him, idolized him, and he took advantage of that. But also, sometimes when we gather around a personality, when that personality dies or is incapacitated, or in my case, comes to a place where they don't have the steam for it anymore because we are human, then people seem, the people seem to dissipate. But if we gather around the idea of freedom and we're able to multiply that idea in more than one person, then the movement becomes unstoppable. The progress to freedom becomes unstoppable. If the regime were to jail one person, it doesn't matter because there is more than one person who is ready to move. So I think that in as much as they were disappointed, it taught Zimbabweans that it is no longer the season for saviors, but I think it's the season for everyone to understand that we all have a stake and we're all responsible for the future of Zimbabwe.
Why do you think it is that people treated individuals like saviors in that manner?
Well, I think that there's a sense sometimes that people would rather preserve themselves and allow one person to face the danger. It's easier, it's cheaper, that way. But then again, it also takes longer when one person faces the brute force, of oppression. So I think sometimes people haven't had a chance to learn how to be courageous, how to be bold. And I think that's probably part of the journey we have now. As I said, if we can't cause the politician to change, then we must inspire the citizen to be bold. The more bolder people you have, the more courageous citizen you have, then I think the more people you have on the front line, and the further the idea and the movement gets to go.
Do you think that kind of worshipping kind of the saviour is something that was specific to the African subcontinent? Or do you think it's something that's seen around the world elsewhere as well?
Oh no, I think it's been seen around the world, as well. Of course, I think in history we see it with, the rise of Adolf Hitler. We see it with different figures. But around Africa and African democracies, which also are kind of drawn from our own homegrown kind of brand of democracy from our cultures and so forth, a lot centers around an individual. And I think this is part of what this new generation of young people is trying to break out of. That yes, whilst we may have individuals that start an idea and that lead from the front, we have to rally more and more people. An idea finds its power when it's multiplied, when more than one person has it. So yeah, I don't think it's unique to Africa, but I think that it has been the cause for continued repression in many of the authoritarian regimes.
How do you think that others all around the world can understand the plight that the Zimbabwean people face and have faced for many years now?
Well, I think that understanding where Zimbabwe is at, first of all, you only have to look at the vast natural resources that she is endowed with, and then look at the kind of economy that she has, and only wonder how it is that a nation so rich can be so poor. That a nation that has got diamonds, platinum, lithium, gold, chrome, even oil reserves, that a nation that has got so much in terms of its arable land can have its citizens that live on less than 50 cents a day. And I think that question has to bring about an understanding that these are people that have been intentionally excluded from the prosperity that their own nation offers them. I was speaking to some MPs at the UK Parliament a few days ago, and they kind of asked the same question and said, how do you think that we can view Zimbabwe's future going forward. And I said, I think it's important for you to understand that Zimbabwe is more than its government. It's more than its politicians. And when you deal with Zimbabwe, as particularly Britain did in the past, that they stop having a Mugabe policy and start having a Zimbabwe policy. That it's about the prosperity of Zimbabwean people and not so much about what one person who's leading from the front thinks. So there is a lot that Zimbabwe has to offer, particularly in this new generation of young people that's coming up. Zimbabwe is we're at a turning point right now, you know, and I feel like this is happening with a lot of African nations as well, where the revolutionary movements are coming to the end of their relevance. They haven't been bad, they did well. It's just that many of them who were our liberators became our oppressors. And I think part of it was the failure to pass the baton on to the next generation of leaders. So I think that when the world looks at Zimbabwe, one of the things that they should understand, besides what I've just talked about in terms of the economy and the natural resources, is the fact that Zimbabwe also has a very wealthy deposit of young leaders, young, capable, creative leaders. And that solving our problems right now and in the future lies in being able to unlock this value that these young people have.
Do you think that there's a role for people around the world to play in the cause? What do you think people can do?
There's a lot that people can do for Zimbabwe in terms of a role. One of those things is perception, understanding that Zimbabwe is not a country that is only in need of economic breakthrough, but that is in need of freedom. I was saying to some of the gentlemen I met just before we came in here, that you will find that our president has been on the road, the new president has been on the road talking about Zimbabwe is open for business. But the real question that needs to be asked is Zimbabwe open for freedom? Even Robert Mugabe wanted economic freedom for Zimbabwe in some shape or form. But the one thing that he did not want was the freedom of the people of Zimbabwe, the democratic freedoms, the constitutional freedoms that are needed in Zimbabwe. He always kept that locked up. And it looks as if the current government is also doing the same. So as people look at Zimbabwe, I think part of them helping to yell for help is to yell for the help that Zimbabweans themselves are asking for. If Zimbabweans are not, at the fight, and I've said this before, that the only people that bring a sustainable and passionate fight for Zimbabwe are Zimbabweans themselves. And so it's important for the international community, for people around the world, to listen to what the people of Zimbabwe are crying out for, and get behind that and support that and help to amplify that.
So speaking of freedoms brings me on to free and fair elections. And Mugabe has relied upon vote rigging and campaigns of violence to win his elections. And as you reminded us earlier, his wife Grace famously said that he could win again even if he was taking part as a corpse. How do you think that change can be brought about even with such adverse conditions?
I think there is one aspect that I have come to learn in the last few years that would bring change in Zimbabwe in the face of rigging. People have often said to me, don't you think that elections should be postponed because there may be rigging? Don't you think that there should be space made by pushing elections forward so that enough space can be made to kind of protect the election and so forth? And all of these things have been done in the past in Zimbabwe. We have had observers, maybe not at the level that we should have had them. We have had donors pour in money for an election to be credible. But there is one thing that we really have never had in Zimbabwe, which is the mass mobilization of people to the ballot box. And that's the one thing that, in my mind, I believe can overcome rigging, is if Zimbabweans can be inspired in mass to get to that polling station, to get to that voting booth and cast their vote. That's the one thing that can overcome rigging, is if we overwhelm that ballot or if we overwhelm that polling station. And I think that there's no way around that. Just as Robert Mugabe could not stand the millions of people that came out to say he must go, I think it's the same way as we go into this election. That if Zimbabweans don't turn out to vote, then we give way for rigging.
So people haven't turned out to vote in droves so far. What do you think will cause the change that is needed to make them all come out to vote?
Well, I think one of the things that has been discouraging in Zimbabwe when it comes to opposition politics has been the inspiration that has been needed from the opposition party to drive the masses to come out. I want to maybe be a little bit excited about what we're about to get into in Zimbabwe, because you have to understand the unlikely situation that this election actually is. 6 months ago, few people could have predicted that both Robert Mugabe and Morgan Tsvangirai would be absent from this election of 2018. These are the two towering figures that have dominated our elections for the past 20 years, and both of them are not there. That sets the playing field for something new to happen. And in the opposition, I'm excited to see some young people standing up and coming up to upset the old guard, to bring in something new and something fresh, something that inspires people. And I'd like to think that we have a chance to mobilize more people than have ever been seen at the Zimbabwean election because of the young people that are starting to come up. If you've been following events back in Zimbabwe, the Movement for Democratic Change, which has been the largest opposition party and is now part of an alliance, which we really hope will grow and galvanize even further, now has to choose a new leader. And there seems to be the front runner, a young man who's just turned 40, and you have to be 40 in Zimbabwe for you to run for president. He's just turned 40, and he seems to be the one that's ascending, and he's energizing that base of young people. He's energizing that base of people that had logged out of politics, many who had begun to log back on in the last 2 years because of the mobilization of citizens. And I think that is going to be the game changer in this election and in the next one as well.
How do you feel about that kind of age restriction of having to be 40?
Well, I think, again, that's been part of the politics of exclusion, in Zimbabwe, is you try and exclude as many people as you can. And that, unfortunately, what that has led to is that it has led to a population that is 60% and below, who are in that age range of 40 and below, being led by people who are in their 70s and who are in their 80s. Now, it's not that being old is something that, excludes you from leading. But I think that the intentionality of bringing young people up front to lead in Zimbabwe has not been genuinely there. Our older politicians in Zimbabwe have only used young people for them to stay in power. But we have an actual opportunity to start replacing and start transitioning young people into leading Zimbabwe. These are the young people that have the ideas, they have the time, they have the energy, as well to take Zimbabwe forward.
Thank you. So I think now's probably the perfect time to open it up to the audience for some questions, if that's okay. If you've got a question, if you'd like to raise your hand and we'll get a microphone over to you. I see a hand right at the front over here.
Thanks for coming down to speak today.
Thank you.
It was great. Freedom is a very contextual thing. So like what freedom is in UK is probably very different from what freedom in India or in Myanmar looks like. What do you think is freedom for Zimbabweans right now? And what do you think the ideal of freedom can be if you so manage to achieve it? I
want to agree with you that freedom is different, but I want to agree to disagree as well at the same time, in that I think the essence of freedom is really the same, in that, and I heard this explained in one of the best ways. If a person can not go to the square of their town or their city and criticize their government freely, and if they're arrested for doing that, they are not in a free country. So I think when we talk about freedoms, we're talking about very basic things and very basic rights. We're talking about the right for you to express yourself freely, the right for you to assemble, the right to associate, the right to express an idea. And in any part of the world where those rights are not respected or afforded their citizens, those people are not free. So I think that Zimbabweans are beginning to connect their lack of freedom with bad governance, with how badly they've been governed. So, maybe, for example, let me put it this way. We've said to people, hey, if you want to know that the leaders we have are bad leaders or will not allow freedom, let's start looking at what our Constitution says. Do they allow us to do those things? If not, no matter what promises they make in speeches, until those things are allowed, then we are not living in a free Zimbabwe, at all. So yeah, I think in a sense that the kind of freedom that we're pursuing in Zimbabwe is one that literally allows us access to build our nation too, with those that are elected to lead.
I see a hand just over there, in the stripy t-shirt.
So thank you for your presentation. Can you tell us a bit more about your past? How did you get the interest in politics, and what are your plans for the future?
I had no interest in politics at all. And like I said, my journey is very much an accidental journey. It's something that if you had told me 2 years ago that I would have been on the front pages of all our newspapers in our country or across the world, or addressing global leaders about Zimbabwe, I would have asked you to have your head examined. But the journey now has meant for me that there is no going back. I think the realization now has been that politics is not for people that are called politicians. Politics is for everybody. One of the things people said to me in Zimbabwe was, but you're a pastor, why are you doing politics? Pastors don't do politics. And for a moment I believed that until I realized the lie in that statement. The fact is I'm a citizen. If you buy bread in your country, if you send your children to school, if you drive a car, if you have to pay for education, you are involved in politics, because everything you're paying for is a result of the politics in your country. And if you don't like the price you're paying for education, if you don't like the price you're paying for bread, then you're going to have to find a way to change that price. And changing that price means you're going to get involved in politics somewhere, somehow. So we were clamoring for basic service delivery when we started out. But we began to realize that you can clamor for service delivery all you want, but until you start changing the policies that are in place, and to change the policies, you have to change the policymakers, and to change the policymakers, you have to change the elected officials, and to change the elected officials, you start having to, you have to change the parties that are involved, or add to the parties that are involved. So this was an unavoidable journey for me. The more I wanted to see change on the ground, the more it led me down the path of being involved in politics. And in terms of the future, I'm talking here about young people getting involved. One of my jobs is to encourage young people to get involved in the upcoming election, is to make themselves available for election, starting with local council, parliament, and even president. It was almost illegal in Zimbabwe for you to ever say, one day I would like to be the president of Zimbabwe. It was a taboo for you to say that. So I think part of my job now is continuing to encourage young people and new people, credible, competent, committed people, to get involved in politics. But for me also, to find a place to model. The one thing that I keep finding important to do in Zimbabwe is to model the kind of citizen, or model the kind of politics that we have never seen. It's not enough to wish it. Someone has to step out and model it. And when more people see a model, they then believe it works, and they're able to follow that model.
Fantastic. Should we go to the question just over there?
Hi. Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you so much for your story. It's so inspiring, and please keep on doing what you're doing.
Thanks.
But my question is around social media, and you seem to imply that Facebook played a huge part in you managing to get your story to the rest of the citizens in Zimbabwe. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on connecting the ability to increase the youth and their participation in democracy and voting and politics in general and social media in Zimbabwe? Do you think this is perhaps a mechanism through which this could be made possible?
Very good question. If there was the one thing that has been the game changer for us in Zimbabwe, especially for someone like me, because you have to understand that I pastor a very small church of only 40 people. And that's been the surprise for many people to say, wait a minute, you have a very small church, but you seem to have been able to have this kind of national and international influence. How is that possible? It's because of social media. Social media has allowed us in Zimbabwe to circumnavigate the laws in place that stop people from gathering to discuss a political idea. So people found that we can discuss it on social media instead of having to gather in a physical place, because the police could walk through the doors and everyone goes into prison. So when I began to post my videos, that first video, I think it had within 2 days, it about 100,000 views, which for me was just like, how is that possible? My views on the videos I used to do for my Christian teachings used to, blow past the amazing figure of 13 and 14 views, at a go. And this is 100,000. And what we discovered was a very interesting, it was like a formula to getting people to get involved. So if I posted a video in which I was speaking truth to power and challenging the government head on, you found that there were people that watched it. And then there were people that would watch it and then they would like it. And that takes a lot. I met a lady at one of the local shopping malls in Zimbabwe who she recognized me. She said to me, you know what, when I started first watching your videos, I used to watch like 10 seconds of it. And then I'd shut it down because I thought that the intelligence was watching me through it, that they knew I had watched the video. But then the more and more I watched it, I realized, no, wait a second, there's a lot of people watching. So some people would view it, and then some people would like it. And then there was a group of people that would comment on it. And then there was a group of people that would share it. And then finally, at the end of that, there was a group of people that would make their own video. And so what social media afforded us was a way in which we could gather around an idea, we could discuss it, we could invite people to it, and it was better than attending a political rally, because I could do this in the comfort of my home or when I was traveling and no one knew where I was. And I think this has become, when you then look at social media in Zimbabwe, in the last 2 years, it has exploded with this discourse of politics, this discourse of holding people to account. Another thing that we never used to have was if a parliamentary committee was sitting down with, say, like most recently, the Minister of Energy in Zimbabwe, to ask him questions about how things were going, if there were any queries, nobody would have had the chance to watch it. But now we get a chance to watch it live on Facebook because a small group of young people started a little hub that they call Open Parley. And what Open Parley does is that they go into these parliamentary portfolio meetings and they broadcast this parliamentary committee review live on Facebook, and everyone gets a chance to watch. And in this particular last one, the Minister of Energy was as arrogant as they come. In fact, he stood up and refused to answer the questions of this committee. That began a whole debate around the arrogance of government ministers towards their citizens. So I think that this is the game changer in Zimbabwe. Our government has actually noticed the same thing, and Emerson Mnangagwa, the new president, has become the first high-level official in government to actually have to actually engage, with Facebook and Twitter. He's got a Twitter account and a Facebook account. Robert Mugabe couldn't care less. He was not interested. But Emerson Mnangagwa is actually on because he realizes that this is where the change is happening. This is where things, as ideas are being born, and that's where they're spreading and starting to, present a challenge to him or bring change to the country.
I think we maybe got time for one more question. So if we go to the hand just over there, yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk and for your energy. I was just wondering, you did mention, I think, a lack of involvement from ordinary people. How would you explain it? And have you ever been so disappointed by it that you sort of lost faith in your fight?
Let me see if I got you right. How do I explain if if we lost, you said if we lost faith?
I mean, have you ever been, have you ever, did you ever lose faith in your fight because maybe people around you are not really reacting like you would like them to react, or, putting as much energy in your fight as you are?
Oh yeah, that's the story of my life. I cannot tell you the number of times that I personally have been disappointed after having given something my all. At the time, she alluded to the time when I left Zimbabwe in July of 2016, and I escaped with my family after after my family was intimidated, and I had just been arrested. And thousands of people on social media literally just came. I mean, the disappointment was so deep within them that they all said, he's a sellout. And I'd been going for 4 months as an individual, making videos and being intimidated, arrested, and followed. And thousands of people said he's a sellout, he's wasted our time. In fact, he's a plant of the government. In fact, he was only after a US visa, a green card. That's why he did it, so he could leave the country. I have never been more disappointed in my life than during that period. But I began to also learn that that's how people are when for 37 years all they have been subjected to is zero outcomes in terms of actions. So it's been that journey. I'm based back in Zimbabwe now because I made a personal decision that I will never be chased from Zimbabwe again. Robert Mugabe threatened me by name and asked me to leave Zimbabwe as an instruction, and said people like Evan Mawarire have got no place in Zimbabwe except special jails that we have for him. And the reason that I went back to Zimbabwe was that I decided that this was never about impressing a group of people, but it was about living up to my ideals, that which I believe. And even if it meant that I rotted in jail and no one believed it, if I stood up for what I believed in, I would die a happy man.